Hello, everyone. Our topic today is really to make sure your rebranding works. So anybody that's going through a rebranding exercise or thinking about a rebranding exercise, there's some things that obviously need to be considered. And this recent Twitter change to X to us is an opportunity to discuss some of these things, right? And so what we're going to try to do is, use this as an example, what to do, and more importantly, perhaps what not to do, because I think Elon Musk has gotten a lot of criticism, largely justified in our opinion, but perhaps not all justified. So I have on our podcast today Renee Yeager. She's co-founder of Yeager Marketing. Has been doing this for quite some time. And Renee, could you just tell us a little bit about your background and your firm and the kinds of things that you guys do?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been a marketer of technology products and services for 25 years. I cringe a little saying that, but it is true. And for the last 14 years, I've had my own agency, Yeager Marketing. So we specialize in working with B2B tech companies. We work with the industry leaders, the most innovative ones out there, and helping them solve their biggest marketing challenges, whether that's building a brand, creating content that converts, or driving demand that help them fuel their pipeline and drive their revenue growth. So that's where we specialize.
Okay, so you are a good person then to talk about this whole Twitter to X change, and maybe start with some of the things that Musk didn't do right, or at least he didn't follow best practices. Just any thoughts about that kind of stuff to get us started?
Yeah, there's been so much said about it. But you're
Yeah.
right. I think the consensus is leaning towards it really wasn't handled the best possible way. Um, I mean, a couple of things really stood out for me. First of all, the lack of focus on the customer or the partners. There was really no, communication that it was happening, when it was happening, what was going to happen. I think it really set people back on their heels. And while the tactical nature of the platform hasn't changed that much other than the logo in the corner, um, as a marketer and as an advertiser, I think it's really continued to erode trust that was already eroding. So not great from that standpoint. I think they also, just based on the news stories, really didn't do their research or their homework before they started planning this, if they planned it. They really didn't look into their global markets. They've been banned in Indonesia. There are many other trademarks for X, including Google and Meta, other tech companies in the space. So they're going to have to deal with some trademark violations and possibly lawsuits from that. And that's something you really don't want in a rebrand. You want to try to mitigate things like that as much as possible. So, but I think this is just kind of true to Elon Musk's history. He's a rebel and he doesn't like to play by the rules. And that's really what happened here. The last point I would say is just consistent messaging. So even after it's happened, there's talk about it online, and there's certainly lots of talk in the media, but it doesn't seem like there's any real direct to customer communication. They did roll out an update to their ad services, which I think is hopefully going to try to win some advertisers back for them. But overall, no real communication strategy is apparent here, and it's a huge miss.
I think a couple of things you said are really interesting. He is known as being, that maverick, that renegade. And he's proven the critics wrong more than once. I can remember, a lot of the bad press that Tesla got, right?
Yeah.
Really an electric vehicle is going to take on General Motors and Ford and all the foreign competitors. And nobody thought, I don't believe, that he could do this. And then SpaceX. I mean, no one is going to be able to, have the financial wherewithal, the engineering chops that NASA has, right? How in the world could you ever think? And in both cases, he proved the critics wrong, but that doesn't mean he did it the right way. And I think it even goes back to Steve Jobs when he started Apple. there was concern back then that, well, there's Apple Music out there, and the Beatles sort of own a lot of that. And then he got into the whole music thing with the music platform and ran into trademark issues. And it ended up costing a whole lot of money, I think, to resolve that issue. And it's like he could save himself so much friction and so much grief had he just done things a little bit differently. So it's not so much he has to change who he is. He can still be that maverick and that renegade, and I think that's part of his appeal for a lot of the folks that follow him and are his supporters. But with just a little bit more mindfulness and intentionality on how you do things, and okay, you don't have the attention span for that. We'll find someone or a group of folks inside that can sort of take that over, so they avoid the ruffled feathers, if you will, and all the other things that you talked about that he didn't do right. Um, One of the comments I think that you made was, um, not adhering to the norms and how brands operate, and this recklessness. And do you feel today, because you've been doing this, as you said, for many years, do you feel today that you pay a much higher price, that the sins aren't forgiven quite as quickly when you sort of go down the path that Twitter went down because of how visible everything is than, say, let's say 10 years ago or when you first started the agency? Or do you think, no, it's still, I'm just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and it's funny because I could see two sides to that, right? I could see some people being really, really put off by what happened, and you've already seen it. Like there are people abandoning the platform, right? But then I also think that in our world today, change is constant, and we also anticipate it. Like, even though this wasn't done the right way, I don't know. I think this may play out for a couple of months and people may gradually go back. It'll be interesting to see how Threads shows up. The timing is pretty amazing there, you know. Um, but I think we've become accustomed to change, and maybe we roll with it a little bit better than we did in the past.
You think about X as the brand, because our we're bringing to the table a very niche perspective on the name itself, and you have a much broader perspective on the whole brand holistically and how you make that work and then communications. But to us, X comes across as a much harsher, potentially colder, sterile brand, especially the way he depicted it, on some of the early pictures in the New York Times and whatnot. Whereas Twitter was a very high touch, sort of inviting, friendly brand. Now, one could say that, well, look, X has got a lot going for it in terms of it can be, extreme disruption or an extraordinarily new experience, or something that's extending the capabilities of Twitter. So you've got that X embedded in extreme and extraordinary and
Hmm.
extended.
Yeah.
But from a branding expert standpoint, what observations would you make there about, well, Twitter had this going for it, and I think you already mentioned the equity that it had to make X work, and maybe over the couple of months you mentioned it's going to work effectively. But what are some watchouts or some gotchas for anybody that's listening to this and going through a rebranding, that if you take something that's as well known as a Twitter and you change it to something that's as radically different and perhaps not as emotionally inviting as an X, what would you suggest that people be concerned about or questions they should ask? Is there anything like that that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think it goes back to his vision for what he wants this to be, right? So Twitter was this communications platform, and that was the nature of it, and that's what it was going to be. From what I understand, I don't know if you've heard the same thing. His vision for what X is much more aligned to like what WeChat has in Asia, where it has much more functionality. It's a very different platform where communications is one piece of it, and there's much more there. It will take time for him to build that, though. So, is he going to alienate um, his existing audience while he does that? Will they see merit in that? Will they want that? I think a big consideration is around who your customer is today and who your customer is going to be tomorrow. And for me, he's playing the long game here. He's focused on who the customer is going to be tomorrow and what he wants to build, or what they want to build, I guess. Um, but not really thinking so much about right now. And, for a visionary type person, who's looking to make transformation happen, that's not unusual. It's just, what's the cost? What's the cost to revenue? What's the cost to customer value, brand equity, all of those things that are starting to kind of erode right now while he does that. It would be nice if he communicated more about the vision of what he wants it to be and kind of what the timeline for that is. Just that might keep people engaged um, in the shorter term.
Yeah, to me, it's really interesting. If it wasn't Elon Musk or maybe a handful of other people that have the persona and the recognition, could even pull this off, right?
Yeah, I
Because
don't think so.
yeah, it's not as easy today, and at least I don't think it's as easy today. And a lot of our clients, they underestimate the value of an existing name or an existing brand because it does have that recognition and that equity. And yeah, granted, Twitter hasn't been around for 30 years, but it's been around long enough to build that global base and awareness. To try to duplicate that today is so hard because it's just
Oh,
so much
yeah.
noisier.
Hmm.
And and so for someone that wasn't Elon Musk, okay, so Elon might be able to pull this off because Elon Musk and he can get a lot of press in the way he does his tweets or whatever they're now going to be called with the X. I don't know if you can call it X's or whatever they are.
X's, yeah.
X's.
I
All right.
heard that. Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know either. For someone else though, for anyone else that's listening to this that's thinking about going through a rebranding and they don't have that kind of presence and visibility, um, what couple things, if you just had to say, here are a couple things that I think, man, you really need to consider before you do it, right? Before you pull the trigger. Uh, what would those, does anything come to mind for you that you would be looking for a new engagement that if I see this or this, that's a big red flag, or if they've got these things lined up, that maybe is a green light to move forward?
I mean, most rebrands are done because there's a problem with the current brand.
Right.
In this case, there wasn't a problem with the current brand, just he has a vision, right? So, if the purpose of the rebrand is to create distance from a problem, that's a fair reason to do it. Anyone who's lived through a big corporate rebrand knows what a beast it is to go through it. It is a massive, massive undertaking and should be done really carefully, especially for a global brand. When you're talking about multiple markets and languages and considerations like that, I mean, the stakes are much, much higher, right? Um, the other things I would say, you got to do your homework. What, aside from, is it the right thing to do? What is it going to look like? And let's do our homework and make sure we're positioning right from a competitive standpoint. We're not getting into any conflicts that we need to be thoughtful of, and understand the impact of those changes, right? How is it going to play out across your company, your stakeholders, your customers, your partners, in all of the markets that you serve? And then, you got to plan that communications and rollout plan, which really didn't happen here. It was very, very haphazard. Had a lot of shock value and definitely got a lot of media attention, but that's not normally how you handle a rebrand, right? That you're trying to mitigate negative impact as much as possible, right? So you're being thoughtful about it. You're really structuring those communications. You're alerting the media before, typically. Then you're alerting customers, and then you're actually doing it. So I just think there are a lot of considerations here that were not factored in at all. So now there's repercussions for them.
I think you bring up a really great point, and so many of the steps you just outlined it goes back to this old saying that everyone I think's probably heard. The devil's in the details, right?
Right.
You have this
Yes.
great vision, and you can talk about how X is going to become something very different than what Twitter was, and it's going to have all these marvelous capabilities, and then someone has to execute, someone has to implement, and like in our in our space, we always have to do trademark searches globally
Right.
on these rebrands. And inevitably, I can't think of one that we've done in the last, few years where there isn't some conflict in some market somewhere in the world, right? And
Yeah.
so, and then you have to dial it back and say, well, okay, how can we tweak the name? And do we really have to have the same brand everywhere, or do we have a different brand in China because of some of the issues over there? Or in the case of what you mentioned in Indonesia, you can't use the X at all. So what's he going to do? And so then it becomes a much more complicated rollout strategy. Whereas when it was first started, it was a simpler world, right? Even 10,
Mhm.
15 years ago, it was a much simpler world to brand things. There wasn't this political correctness concern that we have in the US and to a certain extent in the EU and elsewhere, to where now there's a much greater sensitivity about any off color or off putting meanings or cultural innuendos or nuances that someone could. So there almost seems to be this overcorrection, right? That now it's just got to be a super safe name. And I don't know. I guess this is a question I have for you. Do you think the pendulum is going to swing back at all? I mean, in a lot of the naming work that we do for clients, getting it through their legal, getting it through regulatory in all these different countries seems to be the biggest hurdle. It's not anymore that, well, does this name work from a marketing standpoint? It's, well, we got to get through legal, we got to get through
Right.
regulatory. And you end up with
Right.
this watered down brand and name where you compromise all the sizzle and pizzazz and everything else that was cool because of all these concerns. And I feel that some of our clients end up having to take really outstanding names from a brand standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, off the table because of oversensitivity or ultra conservatism when it comes to regulatory or legal. Do you see that swinging back, or do you even agree with that perspective, or do you have a different take in any of that?
No, I agree with it 100%. And we've had similar experiences. I think there's a low tolerance for risk. Um, Now, will that change? I don't know. I don't think so, to be honest. I think there, again, people just want to try to limit any potential risk, even if it ends up being less than what they wanted, right? Um, Now, someone like an Elon Musk, since we're talking about him, I think there are those folks out there that are willing to take the risks and push the limits and not really care and maybe feel like they have the money and the backing to deal with anything that comes their way. For most corporations, though, that hasn't been my experience.
I think that's a great comment because we have different types of customers and clients, just like I'm sure you do. And for
Hmm.
a lot of mom and pops, right, for a lot of folks that have a very local business, their concern isn't federal trademark, and they can't
Right.
even get a federal trademark because they're not engaging in any interstate commerce where you sell goods and services across the state boundaries. One of the requirements to get a federal trademark. And they're so small, they're not on anybody's radar. And so, not that we advise them to do this, but if they have really no grandiose dreams for expansion, they'll often move forward with a name and a brand in their little local area, in their little niche, and it serves them well for many, many years. The problem is if they are successful and they start to grow and they haven't done the due diligence at the outset, and then they start bumping into, well, now we want to sell throughout the country. Now we want to sell in adjacent countries. Now we want to sell in the EU and the Asia Pac countries. Then things get to be a whole lot more complicated, and there are all these legal issues. Do you have any advice though, if you sort of think about maybe you bifurcate it into startups or just small businesses that they need help in branding, and maybe they have a brand that was their dad's or their mom's and now they want to come up with something that's a little bit more modern and hip and resonates with the millennials,
Hmm.
but they don't really have aspirations to be nationwide. Do you feel that what you would do for them is different than someone that has a much bigger vision, a much more grandiose idea in terms of footprint and geography, or the same basic steps there for both of them, right? That to do this and to roll this out effectively, you still have to go down the same checklist. I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's the same checklist, and I always do that diligence for our clients because I want them to understand what the risk is.
Right.
And then we weigh that risk, right? If my company is headquartered in Arizona, if it's an Arizona company and they're planning on staying in Arizona, we'll look at it from an Arizona perspective. If it's a nationwide company, we put that filter on it. If it's global, it's a different level, right? But for us, the steps are pretty much the same because we want them to understand, what's out there. It does change, all the time, but based on this moment in time, this is what's out there. This is what we need to be wary of. And just know that this is here. I would rather know, personally, I would rather know if it were my rebrand. And I would want that for my customers as well.
You go back to X and Twitter and how effective or ineffective the use of digital media has been there, right? And some of the dangers, even if you're in the state of Arizona, or even if you're not planning to do something quite as grandiose as Elon Musk, the digital world to me offers incredible opportunities, but also unbelievable risks because overnight something can spread like wildfire through the social ether, and it can be positive or negative, and you have very little control over that, right? If you
Right.
stub your toe and you're just in Arizona, but you do something that catches the eye of someone, and then they post it and it gets reposted, and before you know it, the world is coming down. What advice or what guidance or what experiences have you had that in today's digital world where so quickly something that's done well maybe can get a lot more exposure, or something that's a big mistake, and it seems that the big mistakes are picked up on a lot quicker than the big successes? Is there any guidance or advice or just observations from what Elon Musk has done that you think, hey, would be germane and helpful to anybody listening in?
Oh, I mean, it's such a big question, right? And the good is great when you have a local win that gets national attention. That's, amazing. That's always good. On the opposite side, if something goes wrong and it gets national attention, I mean, and we don't do that kind of brand reputation management at Jaeger, but I think there's a lot to be said for stepping up and owning things and being honest and transparent, because, either trying to avoid it or not answering for it doesn't really support a great brand reputation either. So you're better off acknowledging, explaining, giving your perspective, and taking ownership. Because even if you disagree with it, it happened. And as a business leader, we have to take ownership of things that happen under our watch.
Yeah, I think that authenticity and that transparency, and those are words that are overused a lot, but it is so so important. And another thing that we like to suggest to our clients is a little bit of controversy is a good thing, right?
Yeah.
So a name, and again, that's our area of expertise. A name that's a little bit edgy, a name that is a little bit out there, and I would argue that X might fall into this category or it might go beyond. But I think there's a little bit of edginess to X is worth considering because some people don't like it at all. And by that fact, it's worthy of conversation. And before you know it, people are talking about it, and it does spread sort of organically through the digital universe.
Hmm.
The challenge is you don't want a name that's too off-putting. And I think you've already talked about this. Had Elon had his cadre of folks that could execute, that did do a little better job hosting the press ahead of time, letting everybody know the vision and the dream behind an X, it would have been much better received. A little bit of controversy might have still been a good thing, but not quite as much as he got. And again, maybe he can recover, but most firms, can't. Whereas a name that's super safe, or maybe a brand that's super safe, it's very difficult to get that, first of all, because of all the regulatory and legal problems in today's global world.
Hmm.
They just tend to be boring, right?
Right.
Nobody hates them, but nobody loves them. So they're
Right.
this yawner name or this yawner brand. What do you do as a branding firm to sort of adjust that balance, right? You
Yeah.
add a little bit of sizzle, you add a bit, but you also, I mean, do you have any thoughts or just, past experiences, that here's something we did that took it maybe to the edge, but we also were careful by doing our homework and some of the not to go. I mean, is there a specific example that you could provide of anything like that that might educate and provide insight for some of the folks listening in?
Yeah, I mean, your name is critically important. Sometimes, names are either, an old name that has just stayed with the company for a long time, or to your point, like very generic, just super, super safe. We do a lot of messaging work at Jaeger. And that's because we believe it's the differentiator in building a brand, right? So it's critically important. If you have a name, you have to have a story around it, right? You have to have a story around your brand. And that can really help not only kind of elevate either what you've been given or what you're living with, but can reframe it quite a bit and make it interesting, right? So we do, full on messaging platforms and brand storytelling and things like that that can really help there. I don't have a good example for you that I would want to share of one of our clients. But that is a critically important thing. The other benefit of messaging just overall, and I think that that doesn't exist right now. Speaking of X, I'm not sure what the messaging is other than these random comments out on the web. But it helps keep everyone consistent and telling a really consistent story with high value. It's been thought through. We're thinking about our customer, we're thinking about our partners, and we're making sure that our promise to them is very, very clear. And I think that's really, really important. And that is a game changer when it comes to branding.
I think that clarity, that eliminating confusion is foundational, right? If you
Yeah,
don't do
definitely.
that, one of the stories that I can share, and we can take very little credit, really no credit for this, is when we came up with the Angry Orchard name for Boston beer. It wasn't a slam dunk, right? There was concern about, well, why do you have angry in that name? But they did a fantastic job with that story that you just alluded to, and then with the graphics to make it come alive. So one of the things about Angry was, well, it's a hard cider. It's not a traditional cider. And back in the day, there weren't very many hard ciders. I mean, when Angry Orchard came out, it was not a very well-known category of beverages. So it sort of established the category that, oh, if it's an Angry, it's got alcohol. The other thing they did with story and then graphics, which I just thought was brilliant, is the best apples for an apple cider are not the kind of apples you see in a grocery store. They're nice and round and all polished. They're the ugliest looking
Right.
apples in the world. They're these naughty apples, and they've got, oh my gosh, is there a worm in there? I mean, what? And so they put that on the package, right? They had this poor looking tree. It looked like, a Christmas tree out of peanuts, where poor Linus and Charlie Brown's got this Christmas tree and it's got 5 needles and 2 ornaments. It just looks like it's a disaster. Well, this Angry Orchard tree looked like this poor tree. It's obviously angry. It's got these ugly looking apples, but that was part of the story, that those are the
Yeah.
kind of apples. So that story and that messaging and what you wrap around the window dressing, you wrap around the name and the brand, I absolutely agree, make all the difference in the world between a successful rollout and one that just fades away and, no one ever knows about it a year or two afterwards.
Yeah.
We've
I
done a
mean,
lot
you
of
could,
talking. Go
oh,
ahead.
sorry.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, you could even look at a brand like Target. Like Target isn't like the most incredible name, right? But
Right.
look at that
Right.
brand. It's a phenomenal brand. And the things that they do around it are really, really great. So just wanted to add that in
No,
as
I
an
think that's
example.
that's another good example. Are
Yeah.
there any other I think we've covered all the stuff that our listeners wanted to at least get a high level take on the Twitter versus the X and just rebranding in general. Are there any closing remarks or anything else that you'd like to mention that you think, hey, if there's one thing I can leave you with, or a couple of things I want to leave you with that do not forget if you're fixing to go through this rebranding effort, or if you've already started a rebranding effort, is there anything that you would want to leave them with?
Yeah, and I think I mentioned some of this stuff before, but really consider that decision, and know what you're getting into. Think of it. Think of all the touch points of your brand. When you sit back and think about that objectively, you'll be very, very surprised at where your brand lives and across documentation and things that you need to consider, right? So just really think about it. Is it the right thing for us? What is going to be the impact of the change? And are we prepared to undertake it? And within what timeline, right? And then just build a solid plan for what that's going to look like. Make sure you're not surprising people. mitigate the risk of negative impact from the rebrand, and be thoughtful about it. And if you're living with a brand you hate and you just want to do something that you feel is more modern or different or cool, go for it. But just make sure you manage it really, really well.
Yeah,
That'd
I
be
think
my
that
advice.
well, I think that being thoughtful comment is really important. I mean, one of the
Yeah.
things that we all know is that change is usually not well received, right? Most folks like status quo. Most folks don't understand, well, why are you changing the name? Why are you changing the brand? And so having that compelling reason around it and then giving it a chance to sort of grow. So for instance, one of the things that we do when we present new name ideas is we don't let anyone say anything bad about any name we present. And that drives clients crazy, right? Because it's much easier to be the critic than the
Yeah.
advocate. And so
Yeah.
they want to start talking about, well, I want to say this is the dumbest name I've ever seen, and here's why. And then someone else wants to play the game of one-upsmanship. Well, that I agree with that. It's also a silly idea because of this. And before you know it, all the ideas are gone because
Yeah.
there's no such thing as a perfect idea out of the chute, especially when you've got an incumbent, especially when you've got an existing brand that already has the benefit of all that history and story wrapped around it. So what we try to do is we say, hey, look, be the advocate. If there's only one name or one messaging platform you like, and you're not even sure you like that, then just talk about why that might work. And by taking the negative off the table, at least at the outset of that kind of conversation, the clients, folks, the team will talk themselves into names that not everybody was that excited about. So at the end of the conversation, when you do allow criticism, constructive criticism, negative comment, some of these new name ideas or some of these new brand messaging platforms have had a chance to get traction before people just start dissing it. So that would be
Right.
one more thing that I would suggest that people consider. Well, Renee, you've been fantastic. If folks wanted to get a hold of you and find out a little bit more about the kinds of things that you do, how should they go about doing that?
Yeah, you can come to our website at jaegermarketing.com. I'm on LinkedIn as Renee Jaeger, and today I am on X as Renee Jaeger as well. You can find me there.
Yay! Well, Renee, thank you so much for your time today. Greatly appreciated. I think there's a lot of interesting content, hopefully, here that our listeners will value. So thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike.
You bet.